We're here now with Professor Ted Hohola, Professor of Community Regional Planning at the University of New Mexico. Hi Ted, how are you today?
I'm doing good.
I hear you have a new cat with a new name.
Yes, the cat's name is Pedagogy.
All right, and he is happy and well fed. And
Likes the food I got him. Trader Joe's, always the winner.
Right on. Well, you know, Ted, on that note, it would be really great to hear about some of your pedagogy, some of the courses that you teach. Why don't we begin first with your course on human settlements? This is a very important course in our field of planning. What do you do in that course?
Well, one of the main things that I really try to accomplish is to get students to understand the values that they themselves bring. And it really requires a series of exercises, one of which is to get them to understand the origin of their name, both their first name and their last name, and then use that as kind of a jumping off point for looking at demographic information of the hometown where they grew up. So that in combination essentially grounds them and basically reinforces and validates in their minds that number one, that they have something that they have to say in terms of this sort of planning community development context of having grown up someplace and using that as a way that they then inform how it is that they go about doing planning.
And it gets them thinking about themselves in relation to the world around them, their community around them.
But I think more or just as important is the fact that they also then begin to understand that they may be carrying values that may not necessarily be applicable in another kind of situation. So we go through 2/3 of the class essentially going through this, of course, with a lot of the theory and the kind of information that's really necessary for them to begin to evolve and develop their own language about how to discuss this. And then the last part of the class, we do a case study. So we teach them basic skills on how to do oral history and how to do primary archival research, and then wind them up and let them go and see how it is that they actually begin to apply these things in a real context. So this year, the team project is looking at historic communities along the railroad.
Oh, nice.
And then telling the story of how the railroad has impacted and affected these historic communities.
So do they look at settlement patterns, for example?
It's really up to them what it is that they want to look at. All I tell them is that they need to tell a story about how the railroad actually had impacted, or in some cases continues to impact, the way that the people themselves evolve and develop their own sense of place.
Sounds like a nice opportunity for them to learn too about the relationship between economic activity and settlement patterns as well.
Yeah, you just never know what's going to come up. For example, one of the historic communities is San Jose, which has actually turned out to be a really interesting place, because I certainly wasn't prepared at the time when the community made its presentation for them to talk about all the environmental justice issues. I didn't know that there were two Superfund sites there, and both were attributed to the railroad activity and the kinds of industrial types of things that were coming in as a result of access to the railroad. So that's one of the big things in terms of their kind of dealing with a sector plan. So I fully expect the students to sort of be talking about those things in a much more rooted contemporary context, as opposed to some of the other communities which are much more invested in looking at the impact at the turn of the 20th century.
Do you also look at some of the early settlement patterns? I know one of your areas of scholarship has been Pueblo settlements.
That's the grounding that we begin with when we talk about the history and the evolution of settlements here in New Mexico, actually in the Southwest, because I want them to understand that this whole area itself was not a blank slate, and what we call contemporary kinds of city evolution and development are pretty much tied into what were the historic kinds of patterns that existed way back when. So, for example, one of the case studies that I give to them is discussing Rio Rancho and how this came out of the whole early land grant and the sort of severing of these ties between Alameda and Corrales, and how then this sort of then led into a whole evolution of how it is that these common lands then became commodified and essentially set up the stage for all the kind of development that we see going on out there right now.
And that's where Intel is located.
Exactly.
So you also teach our communication studio. This is one of those courses that we want all of our incoming students to take. You want to talk a little bit about that course?
Well, this course has been kind of a challenge because it's been a discussion within our faculty for many, many generations, I should say. And we've sort of had to rethink its intent and its purpose. And it really kind of covers three major areas in terms of how it is that we think about beginning to prepare planning students to communicate. So it begins with looking at the whole issue of how it is that you use writing as a tool in terms of communication. And then it goes into graphics as a tool for communication. And then the last part of it is really public speaking and engagement as also a communication tool. So it's really, in a sense, allowing students to sort of dress rehearse them and do it in what I call a safe environment, because it's one of our few courses that is actually offered as on a credit, no credit basis. And it's really intended for them to make mistakes so that they can learn as a process of the mistakes that they themselves commit. I think the thing that always surprises me is a lot of students think that they are far more prepared and they sort of want to just blow this off and say, oh, I've already done that. But then when we begin to put it into how it is that they perform in conjunction with other students in terms of their performance, that's the real leveler. That's when the learning occurs.
So then they are really they're really forced to learn, or they're given the opportunity to really learn about how we as planners, when we produce information, we then still need to communicate that information in a way that's effective.
Well, that too, and it's hands-on. I mean, it's applied, so they can't fake it. I mean, they're the ones that are up there. Nobody's going to do it for them. So if they themselves don't rehearse and they don't prepare, they know that it shows. It's transparent. So that's where we essentially, so to speak, put the screws on them.
Well, Professor Hohola, we know that you're a Regents Scholar and Regents Lecturer and Distinguished Professor, right?
Regents Professor.
Regents Professor, Distinguished Professor, and Full Professor in our program. You're also an international expert in the field of Indigenous planning, and recently have developed an Indigenous Planning and Design Center, or institute, within the School of Architecture and Planning. So before you tell us too much about the institute, tell us first about some of your own scholarship in this area and your teaching.
Well, people should know that I was Director of Native American Studies for 16 years. And really my commitment to that organization was to create a degree program, which I did. So once I did that, then I basically said, okay, my job is done. So there's a whole bunch of scholarship that is attendant to just looking at Native American Studies as a discipline, and in particular sort of grounding it in the perspectives of the Southwest. A lot of stuff dealing with image making, stereotyping, economic development, all the sort of things that go on as far as community and identity is concerned. But it was also the staging ground for my own particular interests, which really looked at this notion of place and placemaking and how places themselves evolve over time and how influences from the outside then deal with challenging and how it is that communities then meet those challenges in the sense of what we call resiliency. So it was a natural for me then to sort of begin to continue to evolve that. Well, I had a joint appointment with planning, and after '96, when I became full-time faculty, that's when I really started engaging more with the profession. And when I say profession, it's really with other community planners and those that were going to come out of the woodwork that identified themselves as tribal planners. There's a whole history behind that as well too. But ultimately sort of contextualizing it and making it more contemporary in the sense of indigenous planning, which is much more hemispheric in nature than Native American planning or tribal planning as it's sort of done in the Americas per se. So that evolution then was really, in a sense, sort of beginning to think through what is the sort of process, what is the theory, and then how can we begin to use that as a way to inform community development, and beginning to develop a particular kind of way in which then this theory begins to inform how it is that we understand about the evolution of community for indigenous people themselves.
Fantastic. So the Institute then, tell us a little bit about this Institute.
So the Institute, which we call IDPI for Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, was just created in September, and I think it's significant that it was a faculty-wide vote that created this, and its real charge is essentially to sort of begin to lay the groundwork with regards to an interdisciplinary approach, and beginning, at least from my own sort of view, extending the whole School of Architecture and Planning as a resource to the tribes. Earlier I talked a little bit about Native American studies, and we all know as scholars sort of rooted in this kind of endeavor that we tend to sort of what the profession calls ghettoize our programs, which is always problematic. I mean, that's perception from the outside, but half of that is also the fact that the university itself really never makes itself as a resource to the communities. They always talk continually about how these communities serve as the laboratory for the university, but I always have found that very offensive because it really doesn't talk about that reciprocal relationship. So the Institute was really...
Plus it makes them lab rats.
Right, it takes them makes them into rats. That's not good. So from that standpoint, then really this institute is intended in order to give the tribes the opportunity to access the resources in the school as part of the extension of the university in general, and in a sense then be able to pool into not just the physical structure itself and all of the vast resources that we now have as a new school, but also in terms of the minds, the faculty and the students. And I think that we can categorically say that our school probably has the largest proportion of Native students of any major university in the country. Certainly in planning I can say that. Currently we have 12 Native students at the graduate level. 10 of them are Navajo. And just today we received a letter from the Economic Development Office of the Navajo Nation, and they're basically wanting to negotiate an MOU with the school. And in terms of my experience at the university, I've never seen that before, which essentially would officially make a relationship between the Navajo Nation and the School of Architecture and Planning. So it's going full speed ahead.
Congratulations, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, you have currently 12 in community regional planning, but since you've been actively developing the Indigenous planning component, you've had many Indigenous students come and get their master's degree.
Oh, yeah.
with this.
I'm not, how would you say, I'm not akin to not go to other places and steal the best students.
I'm like Kayla Shirley.
Good example,
Absolutely.
I had a 3-year appointment as a visiting distinguished professor with ASU in their planning program, and during that time I had a chance to sort of scout what was going on, and I've now got a kind of a really good basis of where it is that their approaches and how they're informing things, and I can categorically tell you they're nowhere compared to what it is that we're doing here in our program.
Well, another nice thing I think about what you're doing is you're not only extending and building national relationships, but you've done a lot of international relationship building as well, traveling to Mexico, to Canada, to New Zealand. What about some of those relationships?
Well, 4 years ago, we got a grant through FIPSE, which is the funding for the improvement of post-secondary education, to do what we called an Indigenous planning exchange with partners in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan, Puebla, and in Chiapas, and our U.S. partners at ASU. And through that, we were able to allow students to go to each of these schools, informally take classes there in an area dealing with Indigenous planning, and essentially use their own school as a way then that they could go to this international place and be then credited with coursework as well as the same tuition that they would be ordinarily paying if they had stayed in that semester for their studies.
So we've had some exchange relationships there.
So we've had those, but also we've, at the end of the program, we then begin to work cooperatively with other universities to begin to stage these kinds of exchanges where we would then take both faculty and students on a much shorter term basis, 1 week, 2 weeks, and engage in symposia, as well as do more local kinds of experiences, look at things, engage with people. So with that we've been able to actually sponsor a lot of our students to go to these places during the semester.
And what about our relations with New Zealand? Your work with New Zealand?
Well, essentially because there's a conversation going on hemispherically about what is Indigenous planning, there are other places that really now are beginning to sort of lay their own groundwork. And I've been involved in a lot of these kinds of conversations. Of course, they see me as taking the charge with regards to not only sort of mainstreaming it within the profession, but they also see me as an Indigenous person who's very well scholared as well as very well distinguished in just the whole area of planning itself. So I get invited to these places in order to build conversations, to sort of tweak and to sort of give them the benefit of what I've seen in other places. Last year, for example, I was invited to the University of Vancouver, and they're establishing a brand new graduate concentration in Indigenous planning with one of our colleagues who you know, Leonie Sandercock. And then just right before that, I had been invited to one of the Māori universities during a conference that they were doing on natural resources, and during that conference, they actually passed their own resolution to create a Māori Indigenous Planning Institute. So yeah, it's going great guns in lots of different types of places, and I think the benefit of what it is that we bring is that a lot of now what we're doing through our institute is going to help to bring that kind of focus here that a lot of people from all these other places can begin to kind of tie into.
Well, you yourself are Pueblo from Isleta Pueblo. It's one of 19 Pueblos here in New Mexico. So in addition to the Pueblos, the Navajo Nation, we have other nations here. And it sounds like we've got now ties to a lot of other indigenous nations throughout not only the hemisphere, but even beyond.
Well, yeah, all across the country, we've had conversations.
So if somebody were to come here and study indigenous planning, what would they learn?
They would learn essentially what we consider to be kind of the principal tenets of why Indigenous planning as opposed to mainstream planning. And a lot of those are really based on how you pursue community development that is value-based. And that's really important for Indigenous communities because in the core of their being, that's who they are. So of anything that they do in the long term, they want to make sure that they protect that. And particularly in the context of colonialism and post-colonialism, where everybody was telling them that they had to essentially transform themselves to the other, then it's important to have them reassert themselves in a way that's meaningful and relevant to how it is that they see their own communities. So in a way, it's kind of what you might think about in terms of arrested development. So you had Indigenous communities that were doing well, just as it was, and then suddenly they were interrupted as a result of colonizers coming in and basically displacing them. And then you had other entities that came after that that basically began to put them into a wardship arrangement, like in the case of the United States. But all along, and the literature and the policy bears this out, they always thought of them as being wards, which is akin, sort of like a euphemism for children. So the arrested part of it comes from sort of thinking about what might have been if these communities had not been displaced in that way and were allowed to continue to plan and create great architecture and great communities today, and how then can we, in our way of thinking about community development, re-empower them to think back about how they can do that is based on their own values, their own traditions.
You know, this is so wonderful in so many ways, and there's a tendency sometimes in this country for race to be constructed in black and white terms.
Right.
And I think when you introduce not only the Chicano experience, but the indigenous experiences of the Southwest and beyond, right, it really forces another conversation, including that around colonization.
And even from that standpoint, people always ask me, well, what does indigenous mean from that standpoint? And what I always like to explain is that any community can consider itself to be indigenous if they sustain themselves successively over generations in the same place. Because when you do that, then concepts like sustainability kick in, because essentially what has to guide their ability to be able to sustain themselves is their worldview. And
See,
that worldview then essentially is instrumental for what relationship they build. Because the key point of this is that in their minds then they see their responsibility and their role to usher forth to those generations that are yet to come to protect what it is that they have for them.
and then it seems that there's so much applicability of those concepts, you know, beyond just indigenous communities, but to our very survival, it seems, as a society.
Sure.
Or
So that's
societies.
why indigenous is just not tribal. I mean, you have ranchers in the south of New Mexico that behave the same way. For example, you have Hispano communities in northern New Mexico. You have them all over the world, essentially. And it goes against what it is that certainly, in terms of mainstream traditional kinds of standards, we don't all have to consider ourselves as being economically mobile all the time, that it's not necessarily the only value that we then sort of gain as a result of participating in mainstream society.
See, and there's something useful, it seems to me, in that concept of commitment to place, the long-term commitment that comes with that. It also seems like these are some of the very communities that are most threatened right now with some of the economic restructuring and trends around globalization and so on.
Well, again, you know, their predicament is in the face of the fact that, unfortunately, many of these communities have consigned and resigned themselves to sort of being pushed around. They themselves have not empowered or developed their own internal capacity to be able to push back. So even though, and we can take a case of housing, for example, with Native Americans, we have policies that basically say that Native communities have the ability to be able to build houses the way that they want, and 99.9% of what you see in HUD housing is not being applied that way, because it's people in their minds still believe that somehow they have to let the federal agency dictate how it is that they build to the standards of that housing.
So that paternalism, you know, kind of created a form of
Right.
dependency.
So what you see out there is what we call Indian HUD housing, which is basically housing that's designed by bureaucrats. So you know that a house designed by bureaucrats, nobody else in mainstream society would essentially want that. But yet within tribal societies, because there's not that pushback that says, okay, now wait a second here, we have the ability to do it our way, so let's do it that way.
So planning and design helps give them some tools to tackle some of these issues.
Well, I see both planning and designing as being absolutely strategic in terms of how it is that they actually begin to shape the environments that they live in. And I think that the challenge, certainly from what we see from our institute, is the fact that if you go into any Native community, what you see is this kind of community that has evolved, but in the end, as a result of all these stop-and-go measures that have occurred, it doesn't end up in any sort of comprehensive, cohesive whole that really, in a sense, helps to reinforce and validate what it is that they themselves see as a Native community.
So it's really restoring that sense of wholeness in the community.
Exactly, making sure that it makes sense to everybody.
Fantastic. So there's been a lot of graduates of our programs who are now working in tribal settings and in various capacities, living some of these values and using some of these tools.
Yeah.
What are some of your graduates doing, our graduates doing?
Well, it's really interesting, but I think if you look at the long haul of what's occurred, and this has occurred in just sort of little increments, so it's not been one big giant push, but I would say that pretty much all of the tribal planning departments that are here in the region
Have at
either
least
one
one.
time or another had our graduates in the program. And what I find fascinating about this, it's not just native graduates, it's non-native graduates as well too. So, we can go down the line and we can just pick them off. Santo Domingo, Laguna, Acoma, Navajo. There's a myriad of them that have our graduate student or our students that have graduated planning positions there.
Fantastic. And so to that student that might be considering coming to community regional planning and studying Indigenous planning, what kinds of words of encouragement would you put out there for them?
Well, the main one is the fact that they can come into an environment where you have this collegial sense, because it's always been certainly my conviction that part of the learning is from the mentors that you yourself engage with, but also it's your peer group. And a lot of Native students who are coming into our program are carrying many, many important kinds of things in terms of what it is that they want to be able to acquire and develop in skills, and that we're essentially enabling them in order to be able to go back to their reservation communities and make a difference. I cannot say that there, at least from the planning and the design side, are many places that actually accomplish that. Yeah, you have other places that may have more resources or that give sort of more directed, narrow channeled experiences, but I think our mark of distinction is that we're applied and that we actually then not only have students working in our environment, but that they then actually work in the communities that they themselves care about.
Fantastic. And I know you do a lot of collaborative work on health issues and
All over the map.
all over the map. So Ted Hohola, a wonderful professor, Regents professor, distinguished professor, full professor in the Community and Regional Planning program here at the University of New Mexico.